Whenever you are working with objects, it is pretty easy to run into issues if you try to access a sub-object that doesn't exist or an object method that doesn't exist. This can happen when you are working with a collection of objects that should have similar properties. Some of these objects may not have sub-objects or methods like they should or like you think they will. This will cause an error and therefore requires code for working around the problem. Let's first look at an example of the error that could occur, and then we'll see how to address it using a shortcut. So here I have an example object. Now, let's say this is just one example of many user objects I could be working with. And some of these user objects, or most of these user objects, contain a results sub-object. We have here an address sub-object, but it could contain a results sub-object that contains scores. Also, some of these objects have a full name method as well. Now, if we were trying to access those items, let's say, for example, I wanted to grab a final score, and we'll use this object here as an example that doesn't have everything it should. And I'm trying to go down to the results sub-object and grab the score from that results sub-object. All right. So if we save that, and let me just resize this here, take a look at the console. As you can guess, we get an error. It says cannot read properties of undefined, because score is a property that is trying to access a sub-object that is not defined. And so that's why we're getting that error. That same thing would occur if, say, for example, we wanted to do a console log and we wanted to display the full name using a full name method that we assume is a part of this object. We would still get an error. And in this case, it tells us that full name is not a function. Well, because it doesn't exist. It's not showing up inside of this object, so we can't really use it. Now, let me show you one more example of the type of thing that can happen. Let's say many of these objects also have a quizzes array. There's one of the properties on the object that usually lists all the quizzes that have taken, but if none have been taken, it doesn't show up on some of the objects. If we then try to access one of those quizzes, when the scores from one of those quizzes like this, accessing the quizzes property, which is supposed to be an array, and then indicating which one we wanted to get, we of course in that case would also get an error. And once again, it's telling us can't read properties of undefined, because we're trying to read one of the elements of an array that does not exist, that is currently undefined in this current object. Even though it may exist in some of the other objects in this collection, does not exist in this one. So this is the problem we're dealing with. Now, to prevent this kind of problem, we would usually employ an if statement, or we could use one of the shortcuts we've looked at earlier in this section. Let's look at both of those so we can see the advantages and disadvantages of how long it would take for an if statement. We'll just underscore that. Here's the if statement here. We would check in the case of doing the results one up here, we check first to see if user.results exists. And if it does, then we go ahead and set final score equal to user.results.score, like that. Okay. And when we do something like this, then we don't get an error, because it's checking to see if that exists before it tries to access something on a value that's undefined. And so we eliminate that error. Now, the same type of thing could be done here using the logical operator shortcut that we've talked about earlier. So do final score here. And what we do is we first, on the left-hand side of the logical operator, we check for the results sub-object to see if it even exists. Logical and If this exists, if it results in true, then it will return the score like that. All right. So that would be an easier way to do that. Wouldn't require as much typing, and nice quick shortcut. Let's look at one more shortcut like this. Let's use the quiz example, because this is a little bit different here. We would first check to make sure the quizzes array even exists, logical and user.quizzes, and then we can access the score that we want. Okay. If this returns true, then we'll return this. That's what we're doing here with this logical and. So these are some ways to use shortcuts we've already talked about to deal with this. But a more straightforward shortcut is using the optional chaining operator. This operator provides a way to simplify the accessing of values through connected objects without worrying about the error problem. It takes care of that error problem for us. And it's more straightforward than this and uses fewer keystrokes as well. So it can be a shortcut that is nice to use in this type of situation. Now, the optional chaining operator consists of a question mark and a period. So let's apply it to these three previous examples to see how it would be used. Okay, so let me go ahead and comment out these ones here. And we'll apply it to that first one, the final score we're talking about. User.results. Okay, so this is the results object. Now, if this sub-object may or may not exist, then we use optional chaining for the thing we want to access after that. We have a question mark and a period. And what this will do is this will check for the presence of this results sub-object first before it tries to access the score. So it takes care of these things up here that we use in these examples here. It takes care of that for us. And as you can see, uses fewer keystrokes and is also more straightforward because it looks like the traditional way we're accessing data in an object. Let's go ahead and save that and see if that prevents the error from showing up. And it does. Now, let's look at some of the other examples. Let's say we wanted to access the full name method that should exist, but may or may not exist. And we're not sure. We would just want to make sure we don't get an error when we're trying to access this. This is how we do it with the optional chaining operator. Notice we have the name of the method here, the optional chaining operator, and then the double parens to invoke that method. Okay, so if we go ahead and save that, we can see we don't get, well, it does invoke it, notice, meaning it causes the console.log to run, but what does it display? Well, it displays undefined because there is not a full name method. Now, what if we went ahead and added that full name method in here? Just going to do a really quick one here. Could have done this with a template screen as well. Put a comma there. Now we can see it works for us. So the optional chaining, it will run it if it exists. If not, we're not going to get the error, which we would normally do. All right, one more example. We got to do actually I'm going to do two more examples, but let's do the quiz example here first before I do that last example. So if we're going to access quiz 4, set that equal to user.quizzes, and then if we want to access something after that, if this is the part that may or may not exist, then we use the optional chaining like that, and then access it as we normally would. So this is a little bit different the way we put this optional chaining operator between things here, but it prevents us from getting that error. We don't get the error showing up. And then if I go ahead and add, I'm going to add a quizzes property up here so we can see that it would pull out the data. If we go ahead and add that up here, and we take a look at quiz, what was it for? Yeah. We see we got a number from it. We're able to retrieve something. So if it doesn't exist, it won't get the error. If it does exist, it'll go ahead and retrieve the information. All right. One final example here. I want to point out what can be done with optional chaining. And this is, we can use optional chaining with an evaluated expression. So let's say there could be a results object, as we've been talking about, that contains scores, and these scores are numbered. Say there's score 1, score 2, score 3, and so on. We can use an expression to determine the property dynamically, and we do that with square brackets. But how would you do that with optional chaining? Well, let's go ahead and take a look at that example. So let's say that the variable that is dynamic is num right now, and that's set to 2. Well, we can go ahead and use that dynamic variable to retrieve a score. I'm not sure why I'm creating a score for variable, but we'll go with it. Results, and then, and then if I had the square brackets here and did score plus num like that, we're using the square brackets to dynamically create a property here that we want to retrieve from the results sub-object. But as you can guess, that would give us an undefined error. Well, we can use our optional chaining, similar to what we did with the array up here. We can use our optional chaining before that piece right there. And then we don't get the error. And then if it does exist, we're able to retrieve that. So another nice use of that optional chaining. So this is a very slick shortcut to use when working with sub-objects or methods that may or may not exist in a collection of objects that we're dealing with. All right, let's move on.